this sign is a good example of that. So a warning sign warning people that the water is polluted, very high in mercury levels. Next one I was going to mention is my own community of Saint-Cadenais, but also related communities of Quedacha and McLeod Lake. And for those of you who had the chance to watch my cousin's documentary last year, it was screened here on campus, deals directly with this, but this is the impacts of the Williston Lake Reservoir, which is British Columbia's largest lake, although it's entirely artificially created. So there was no lake there prior to 1968. It was just rivers. Similar thing you will be experiencing this year and upcoming years with regards to Site C. So parts of the Peace River will turn into a reservoir. With regards to this, the federal, provincial government and BC Hydro only focused on lost reserve land as well as lost trapline land. So with regards to impact studies, they were minimal. Ray Williston, whose name is lent to the lake itself or to the reservoir itself, famously stated later on that he didn't know what the word ecology meant when they were building the dam. And so it was a very easy equation of the nation is going to lose 160 acres of land, so the nation's going to get 160 acres of land in replacement. Nothing more, nothing less. For flooded out trap lines, there monetary compensation if your trap line was going to be flooded by the reservoir, not if your trap line was negatively impacted by the reservoir. So a good example of an environmental injustice, adding insult to injury. Rather than consult with my community, they consulted with the related community of McLeod Lake, which the chief of McLeod Lake, who is very much alive as far as I know, is still not happy about. And when they actually consulted with him, he was honest, like, you can talk to me if you want, this is what my opinion is, but you need to talk to the nation in question that's being flooded out. And the justification was cheap electricity. So the Bennett's Dam still produces up to a fifth of the power in British Columbia at any given moment. And depending on the time period, maybe more, maybe less. So, but that was the main justification behind it. Flooding out the community, and then getting a little more political, the Northern Gateway Pipeline, the Wet'suwet'en or Unisoten, depending on who you ask. And the protests against it, but as well as the Coastal GasLink, the Pacific Trail Pipeline, this general sense that this line is going to be detrimental to the environment, detrimental to the community, and that the community is opposed to it and therefore will take steps to actually prevent it from happening. Led to a lot of issues regarding litigation, but also conflicts with the police. There's currently court cases that are underway. But again, it highlights larger questions that exist in Canada, particularly with regards to Aboriginal title, land, and it's important to point out that Aboriginal title is recognized as an Aboriginal right under Canadian law, but also voice, who has authority to speak for who. A lot of Canadians had no idea what a hereditary chief was prior to these protests. A lot of Canadians were very surprised to find out the hereditary chief still exists, because there are a number of hereditary chiefs who came out against this. There are also hereditary chiefs who were for it. So I actually know one of them. He was removed as a hereditary chief. And then timing, this question of when to act. And this gets into a larger question regarding environmental justice from a historical perspective. A reasonable person would have a sense that this is going to create a problem, and that's really where the big concern comes in. What does it mean if you're going to dump mercury straight into a lake? Is that going to be good for people, or is it going to be bad for people? Nothing is really done. What's going to happen when you flood out a huge part of the province to create the largest lake in the province? What's going to happen when you build a pipeline? And it really gets into these large questions. Do you act preemptively, or do you act reactively? So are you going to get ahead of it, or are you going to get behind it? Do you hope for the best? Do you plan for the worst? And what are you missing? So just larger questions. And this is, if you're not familiar with this, this is actually an internet meme. So you can find videos like this on YouTube, TikTok, and other things. This idea, it was at this moment that he knew he fucked up. For a lot of these environmental injustices, hindsight is 2020, and it becomes really apparent that things probably should have been done differently. So, and then getting into environmental justice, there's also the Blueberry case, and this is something that is further complicating the situation in Canada. This is a recent court case regarding the Blueberry First Nation. Proper name is the Yehi case, but in this particular case, the Blueberry First Nation argued that the province, in allowing oil and gas development in the Peace River country, negatively impacted their treaty rights under Treaty 8, and that the province was under the obligation to look after those treaty rights, to protect them. And the Supreme Court of Canada came back with a ruling saying, yes, the province does have a responsibility to look after treaty rights, It is still relatively recent, really hard to say what will actually come out of it, but it does seem to kind of change some of the paradigms with regards to how developments are made, how they're constructed, how planning is conducted, and other things like that. Also reflecting this, we have bills like Bill C-226 or 226, an act respecting the development of a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice. It is designed to combat environmental racism. It's currently being considered by the Standing Senate Committee on Energy, the Environment, and Natural Resources after a second reading. It may become part of Canadian law. It might not, though. So there was a previous bill, Bill C-230, which died in the House of Commons. So it has reached the Senate. It's a good opportunity that it will. One thing that's important to point out, though, it's good, but it's not necessarily great. So there are larger questions regarding it. One of the big things with Bill C-226 is that it's short. So it talks about developing a national strategy. It doesn't necessarily say what that national strategy is. There are also larger questions whether or not the federal government has a constitutional jurisdiction to actually pass this law. And this is something that we do need to consider with regards to legal systems here in Canada, because the Supreme Court already struck down the environmental impact law that the federal government put forward. So this happened, I believe it was last fall. It was struck down as being unconstitutional. It's possible that Bill C-226 might also be struck down. There's also no commitment to Aboriginal treaty rights, just some vague languages regarding fighting environmental racism. So there are larger concerns regarding that. In theory, the Blueberry case informs it, but neither is a liberum veto. It's not a golden veto, not the ability of First Nations to simply stop things. There's also raises a question regarding the larger good. So in 2020, I criticized Jedediah Purdy's Commonwealth for downplaying colonialism. Purdy is an environmental lawyer out of the United States, and he wrote a wonderful book talking about what we need to do to fight climate change. And it was the sense that we need to create a Commonwealth to fight it, but he does downplay colonialism in a big way there. And this is highlighted with the issue of the greater good. It's relatively easy to inflict environmental injustices on the minority and say it is for the greater good. So Grassy Narrows, we need paper. W.C. Bennett Dam, we need power. Pipelines, we need oil and gas. So there are larger questions regarding what is environmental justice, but what also is the greater good, and what do you do with regards to minorities that may exist in those situations. And I would say this is where Aboriginal and treaty rights really come in. So having a proper understanding of what they mean and what they represent. That is it. So thank you. Welcome further conversation regarding this topic.
For our second presenter, we have Dr. Gabrielle Daou. Dr. Gabrielle Daou's areas of research include a focus on relationships between environmental and climate change, water and insecurity, and on approaches to an experience of humanitarian and development interventions. Her current work explores everyday understandings and experiences of and responses to conflict and climate-related insecurities with a particular focus on the Lake Chad region. Over the past decade, she has contributed to numerous policy and practice-oriented research projects with international organizations such as UNICEF and governmental bodies in the UK.
I'm not particularly organized. I don't have slides, so you just have to listen to me talk. Right, I need to set my timer so I don't ramble on for too long. So my own areas of research on climate change have largely focused on the relationships between climate change with a particular focus on the impacts of water and various forms of insecurity and conflict, the impacts of climate change within contexts that are affected by violent conflict, and at the same time how the impacts of climate change and violent conflict intersect with broader forms of systemic and structural violence and vulnerabilities. My own work focuses particularly on the Lake Chad region, which is located between Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. Although some of the work, the collaborative work that I've been involved in has focused on a much wider range of geographic contexts, but largely encompass spaces that are often identified in public and policy narratives by government officials, international organizations, activists, media reporting, as spaces of climate conflict, whether this is Sudan, Syria, Lake Chad region, and elsewhere, places that are often identified as sort of cases of the impacts of climate change in driving violent conflict, unrest, terrorism, and so on. And myself and colleagues have been very critical of these kinds of narratives, which are often used to draw attention to the significance of climate change, to mobilize responses to climate change, to mobilize climate mitigation efforts, and so on. But are largely not supported by existing evidence, and also underpinned by quite racist and colonial logics about environmental determinism and about the assumptions about where conflict is located. And so I wanted to talk a bit about how this work has informed my own thinking on environmental justice, and how that has, I guess, informed some of the more recent work that I've been doing on, or been involved in, on climate change, environmental change, and insecurities. So what did I want to say about this? The work that I've been involved in to date on climate change and violent conflict has shown that rather than being driven by climate change, many of the conflicts in the sites that are often identified as examples of climate conflict are instead, these dynamics of conflict are instead underpinned by long-standing colonial histories of dispossession and displacement, sort of picking up on some of the themes that Daniel was just discussing, by colonial and post-colonial state building and development efforts, including large-scale water management, the building of dams, the expansion of irrigated agriculture, any energy development, which have all driven large-scale displacement, dispossession, disruption of livelihoods, and deeply rooted forms of insecurity. And this analysis of, or this work on these political and economic and historical drivers of insecurity and the ways that those intersect with climate change have informed the ways that I've been thinking about environmental justice and what that means in the context in which climate change is so often connected to, or said to be connected to, violent conflict and insecurities on a global scale. And so I wanted to highlight, I think, 4 or 5 points, hopefully I have time to get through all of those, that I think are important to consider in relation to climate justice, to environmental justice, and especially what this means in contexts that are affected by violent conflict. Often discussions around the ways in which climate change intersects with or impacts on violent conflict, and specifically the geographic contexts that are most often centered in these discussions, point to particular places and people as especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. That's very, very true due to colonial histories and the legacies of colonialism within the global system. But I think environmental justice requires examining these global and more localized dynamics of vulnerability related to race, to class, to geography, and more, not as inherent conditions or accidental conditions, but ones that are very actively produced and reproduced on global and localized scales by specific systems and structures. As Farhana Sultana writes, these global dynamics of vulnerability to the impacts of climate change and to associated insecurities are driven by colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, international development, and geopolitics. And so ideas about particular places and people as being inherently vulnerable to climate change are underpinned by deeply racialized and gendered logics of disposability that essentially naturalize the suffering of some, the loss of some who are deemed vulnerable. And this leads to my second point regarding environmental justice and connections to climate and climate change and insecurity. And that is the need to really critically consider the kinds of green or sustainable solutions that are imagined in response to climate change on scale and the implications of the ways that especially the global north approaches questions of climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. Often the kinds of solutions that are imagined, especially through sort of state-led, internationally supported interventions, the building of dams for hydropower, the establishment of large-scale wind farms or solar farms, involve profound dynamics of dispossession and displacement that drive intensified insecurities for those who are already made particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so all of this, and this is the third point that I wanted to highlight in relation to how I've been thinking or trying to work through this question of environmental justice, is the need to center how climate change and associated insecurities and injustices are understood and experienced by those who are most directly affected. As Aisha Siddiqui, who's a brilliant scholar and colleague, suggests, attention to what climate and insecurity or security actually means for those who are living with the precarity of climate change and different types of insecurity and conflict. And this again draws attention to the profoundly uneven and unequal impacts and experiences of climate change on a global scale and within more localized communities that are linked to how people are located within particular structural dynamics of power and vulnerability, whether again that's in terms of geographic location, class, gender, and so on. And so this way of thinking about environmental justice is less about sort of impositions of particular visions of what justice means and what it entails, but rather centering those who are experiencing the impacts of climate change and associated insecurities as not just victims, but as knowledge producers who should be at the center of how we understand or how the impacts of climate change, the ways that those intersect with different forms of insecurities and directions for climate and environmental justice are conceptualized. The fourth point that I wanted to highlight following from that around environmental justice is that often discussions of the impacts of climate change on a global scale in the context of my work, discussions about the ways that climate change impacts intersect with the impacts of violent conflict, tend to sort of center on narratives of violence, of vulnerability, of victimhood. And while it's absolutely crucial to consider the very real experiences of risk and harm that are associated with the impacts of climate change, approaches oriented toward environmental justice should also center people's agency, including the ways in which they do respond to, cope with, adapt to, and resist experiences and impacts of climate change, and resist in sometimes sort of small and intimate ways the structures of vulnerability that shape their experiences of climate-related insecurities. And so rather than portraying experiences of climate-related insecurities predominantly through a lens of vulnerability and victimhood, presenting people most impacted by climate change and violent conflict as sort of those to be rescued or made resilient through expert external interventions, or in the case of contexts of violent conflict, to be pacified through militarized interventions, centering existing and everyday responses, adaptations, and resistance to those structures of violence. And finally, the ways that I've been thinking about environmental justice, or what justice might mean in relation to my own work, have been thinking about what it might mean to move beyond a focus only on harm, on damage, on insecurity in discussions of climate-related impacts, especially in contexts affected by violent conflict, and to perhaps not instead, but at least also consider forms of care, of solidarity, and of hope that people mobilize in the face of climate-related insecurities. for Hannah Sultana, again, describes how feeling of despair can coexist with alternative, quote, alternative possibilities, collectivizing, world-making, critical hope, and radical care. And I think that this has been something that I've been thinking through, and thinking about how that might shift the ways that we center, or that we center the agency and the experiences of and the resistance of people who are made the most vulnerable to climate change impacts and attendant insecurities. Currently, I've been looking at this by thinking about how activists from the Lake Chad region, and especially women activists, young women activists, are sort of narrating or talking about the impacts of climate change in context of longstanding violent conflict, as well as through current ongoing research in Niger that includes a focus on, quote, traditional forms of social assistance and solidarity mechanisms that communities have long used to respond to the impacts of climate change and violent conflict that has been affecting the country for years. And I think the final point that I would make is that I think this focus on, in terms of thinking about environmental justice and what that means in contexts most affected by the impacts of climate change and violent conflict, that trying to center knowledge, to center the ways that people survive and resist those various intersecting insecurities, and by centering forms of care and solidarity and hope, that this matters sort of globally, but I think it's perhaps especially important in terms of shifting perceptions of regions like the Lake Chad region, which are typically presented in discussions of climate change and insecurity as predominantly, if not solely, spaces of conflict and violence, and far more rarely as spaces of expertise, of solidarity, and of care in sort of the political discussions around climate change and insecurity that have been, that sort of circulate for various reasons. So that's what
Now we'll have Adriana to introduce.
No, I actually need to. Actually, I'm gonna grab some more.
Yes, please. You can grab some water. This speaker is in. This must be so parched.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, just.
Thank you.
Presentation.
So Dr. June Garcia Becerra holds a background in chemical engineering and biotechnology, specializing in ecological engineering. Her research portfolio spans across engineering and interdisciplinary projects. As the head of the Water and Sanitation Holistic Technologies Research Group at UNBC, she's dedicated to pioneering sustainable and resilience-oriented decentralized water and sanitation solutions. Furthermore, her professional journey includes extensive industry involvement in municipal and biopharmaceutical sectors, where she has contributed to sustainable urbanization projects, municipal wastewater treatment, process design, assess management, and biopharmaceutical downstream purification. Please welcome Dr. June.
Hi, so as you can see, I'm not very good at talking about justice, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about the work that I've been doing related to climate change. So basically in the sort of it's in the intersection between climate change and water. Actually, me and Gabriel have sometimes talked a little bit about our common interest. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the type of work that I've also done with, this isn't back in Mexico, but I am going to continue it here. I moved here to northern BC in about 2.5 years ago. So this is something that I will continue. But basically, I want to tell you about the work that's done in priority-based adaptation to climate change. Climate change induced drought in peri-urban areas. So who knows what a peri-urban area is? Has anyone heard about it? Okay, brownie points for my student.
Are the places that are developing around the city?
Exactly. Yeah, basically. So I'll tell you a little bit about the context of Mexico, about climate change, and then I'll tell you why I've been focusing on peri-urban areas, and hopefully I'll be able to link with some of the items that have been discussed by the previous two panelists. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, Mexico lies in an arid climate, basically. So we're very close to one of the tropics. And so basically, if you see where Mexico lies, if you go and you draw a line, across the globe, you'll see that that's where, for example, where the Sahara Desert is, or where the Gobi Desert is. So basically, Mexico is placed in a location where we have some of the greatest deserts across the world. The reason Mexico is not a huge desert is because of the landscape and all the type of mountainous regions that we are. But it doesn't mean that so because of that, that's why we have some humidities, because basically mountains are machinery that creates rain, and we have quite a bit of those. But we are in an arid area. So basically 60% of a territory is in a somewhat arid or water deficient space. Unfortunately, where most of the dry area is, we have 70% of our population. So it's similar to what happens, let's say, in California, where you will have, I don't know if you are familiar with California, but basically, like LA, San Diego, everything sort of in the south. And that's where 25% of the water resources are. And then all the water resources are up in the north. So it sort of starts happening what we've seen sort of here with Daniel was sort of mentioning, Dr. Sims was mentioning, where there's resource rich places that somehow those resources get sent to these communities that sort of need them. And so what's the sort of the type of discussion that you have? And so basically that's also what ends up happening with peri-urban areas. So I can't talk about, I am in engineering space, so I'm not, knowledgeable about things in a profound way what justice means. But I do know, for example, the peri-urban areas, which are the spaces that generate an interface between cities and rural spaces, they're actually essential to maintaining the city's livability. And so what ends up happening is that these spaces provide a lot of ecosystemic functions, a lot of ecosystemic services to the rest of the city. So however, they're highly vulnerable to the growth of the city. And for better or for worse, in the 21st century, we start having a dynamic more of a city state, where cities become black holes of resources in many ways. And so peri-urban areas become very sensitive and vulnerable. And unfortunately, they do have to, they abide to whatever rhythm and growths and needs that the city has. So they become enslaved, let's say, to what cities talk about it. So also what's important about talking about climate change, especially in the peri-urban areas, is that they'll be vulnerable to both micro and global climate changes. So what do you think micro climate change might refer to? I don't know if you've heard. Have you heard of heat islands in cities? So what does that mean?
It's usually due to a high percentage of tarmac and asphalt, stuff like that, stuff that absorbs heat and then releases it into the atmosphere. So for example, right now we're worried about changes of 2 degrees, 2.5, 3 degrees changes on average. Peri-urban areas might start experiencing 10 degrees changes, 25, 15 degrees changes, just because of the changes that cities are procuring onto their neighboring ecosystems. So that's why peri-urban areas have been having to face these antagonistic relationships between the cities that depend on them, that they extract resources from them, and then they become very vulnerable because also they have to follow the rhythms of real estate development, etc. So
there's multiple reasons of how these systems are very interesting to study for us. So for example, this is something I wanted you to see. This is the city of Hermosillo. This is in the state of Sonora. So this is Mexico. And up here, you'll have Arizona, for example. So that's another contentious situation because, for example, in this Sonora, because we are economically tied to the US, and for decades, the US would not use the term climate change. And the community south of the border, even though we were using climate change, we couldn't follow 100% of climate change adaptation processes. So basically what, the contentious topic there is what the term that we were using in the city of Sonora was, the city of Hermosillo, which is in the state of Sonora, it was climate change type mega drought. So that was the term that we were using. But basically, what has been happening in this place for multiple reasons. So here, for example, we would have the river, the Rio Grande, which is a natural division between the states and the US. It's been dried out, right? It's been like decades since this river does not reach the ocean. That's because there's a lot of water use of both spaces. So imagine that once upon a time you had a very magnificent river and now it doesn't even exist. Not because you put a dam to it, but because you have all these little straws that are constantly consuming water from it. So of course, Hermosillo is here, and there's a river here that you can't see, but this is the San Miguel River. It was sort of the same thing. A dam was created to provide water to Hermosillo, but as you can see, this is the place where San Pedro El Saucido is, which is a small community, a peri-urban community that has various type of interesting structures. So one of the things that it has is that, it has 1,800 hectares, 3,000 inhabitants. But these type of communities in Mexico, they have self-governing capabilities. These are called ejidos, and these are community-owned lands. They usually have, so this is what I was saying, these are ejidos, which are communal lands with self-management and self-governance capabilities. So on the one hand, they can have a say in what goes on in their territory, but on the other hand, like it's very hands-off the government with what they can, what type of services they provide. So it can be both a curse and a blessing. They used to have traditional activities like agriculture, livestock, horse breeding. But of course, as the San Miguel River has been dried out, this whole area has been experiencing mega drought. That river no longer goes through San Pedro. So it used to go into it and then out of it towards the dam. But that river hasn't been existing for a couple of decades now. So anyways, for the most part, they live on groundwater, which is another big aspect that I'm not going to cover. That also has has a lot to do with climate change, and we can talk about it. So sort of the knowledge gaps that we were trying to address is, and sort of trying to talk a little bit of what Gabriel was mentioning, in that understanding climate change processes more from adaptation point of view. So vulnerabilities are important, but for me, it's also important to understand what are the capacity building processes that we can support in a given community so that they can adapt to their new reality. Because the thing is that river has gone away, that mega drought is here, set in place, and it's not going to change in the foreseeable future. So what we wanted to do is understand, for example, how was it that this communities understood itself now under the reality of climate change? So in that sense, we were doing site-to-site diagnosis. So it wasn't just some experts going to a community and extracting information, and understand, it's like, oh, you have a problem. What's your problem? So instead of saying that, it was more about like, what's your current reality? How do you want to diagnose it? And also, what do you want to do about it? So also having site-to-site decision-making processes. And that again, because the capabilities that this community has is that it's self-governed. So it has that ability to take decisions. And also understanding, providing solutions that are problem-based. So it's not like, oh, I've got a dam. So how are we going to solve your problem with a dam? It's more of like, well, what type of problem do you have? And then what type of solution can we provide to that perceived problem that you understand? And so here, one of the main problems that they had to deal with was a rise in temperature and heat waves and increased drought. I want you to understand that the rise in temperature maybe doesn't sound like a big deal, but for example, these people had to deal with 50 degrees Celsius now, when before, historically, they'd been dealing with 35 to 40. This 10-degree change, which I mentioned, had been, procured because how the city had been developing, extracting, cutting down trees, which changes the ecosystem quite a bit. But what that was generating was, for example, that neighbors were no longer able to stand on the road, on the street, and talk to each other. So it started generating these spaces, like when it snows here, you can't really go outside and socialize with people. So that's what the rise in temperature was doing. And heat waves were also generating quite a different type of diseases, vectors, so mosquitoes, this and that, they start behaving differently. And so other types of diseases get promoted. And of course, there's the increased drought, which is complicated because this community also had some sort of agricultural practices. So then they no longer were able to carry those things out. So anyway, so here what we wanted to do was develop adaptation, vulnerability reduction strategies and propose in a participatory and very sustainable actions that will build in resilience. And so from engineering, I'm not going to go too much into that. But basically what we wanted to do is having these processes of adaptation and resilience building actions. It was an interdisciplinary study where we would have people like environmental economists. I specialize in ecological engineering and small scale solutions. So no dams, or that's something I wouldn't recommend, or no huge large scale solutions. For me, it's also just like you can provide capacity building strategies to a community, you could provide capacity building solutions to an ecosystem that probably just want to start promoting different dynamics or strengthening dynamics that already exist there. We also had concepts like socio-ecological systems, resilience, and side-by-side governance. And of course, we were using best practices suggested by the IPCC, that's the International Panel for Climate Change. The areas that, so after the various side-by-side diagnosis, we understood that we needed to provide solutions or some sort of response to household well-being, economic activities, infrastructure, and social networks. So it could be more of a holistic approach. So anyways, we used a method that I'm not going to go too much into it, but basically we were able to talk to a community with this side-by-side diagnosis. And we were able to see that even a very small community can have diversity in it themselves. And I think that's sometimes something that we miss, that we think a small community, oh, we can all just provide sort of the same dialogue, we can sort of have the same conversations, and that's not necessarily the truth. So we use a technique called the Q method. Again, I'm not going to delve too much into it, but basically what we were able to see is that there was really 3 types of groups amongst these 3,000 individuals. There were people that were preferring independent and very pragmatic type of solutions. There was another group that had more of a collective vision, but they were very much attached to conventional solutions. So if you talk to them about building maybe a small dam or building another well or drilling another well, they were very happy and comfortable with those ones, with those type of more conventional solutions. And then there were other people that were thinking more about the collectivity, the solutions that would provide more benefit, more increased well-being to most individuals, and they were open to more ecosystemic or nature-based solutions. So, for example, these people would prefer more air conditioning or cheaper air conditioning versus these people would say, well, what if we give more green infrastructure and then we can offset some of the heat in your home? So just sort of like by doing this exercise, we were also able to see that there could be a common narrative. So, so what these numbers represent is the statements that we gave them that were based on solutions that we came up with, both side by side with the community and also with the group of experts. But for example, here what you can see is statement 15 is of lowest priorities to all groups. So even though they're all different, number 15 seemed to be lowest priority. And could you guess what number 15 is? I know it's like a long shot. It was number 15, surprisingly, was that no one thought that moving, selling their land was a solution, because we gave them that as a solution. You can just sell, save yourself, go somewhere else. And the community said, like, all of them said that they wouldn't do that, right? So it also starts telling you about the capabilities and the resistance that people can also have within their ecosystem. So anyways, we came up with a couple of solutions that everyone liked, even though they were or could prioritize. So for example, build local green infrastructure through reforestation, install household solar panels, produce local food sources, and reduce water consumption, for example. And anyways, so I know I'm running out of time, but basically what I do want to say, more from the engineering maybe perspective, or more from the adaptation perspective, as you were saying, like going beyond the vulnerabilities, is that the reality is that we are going to have to change. And very important, we're going to have to change while maintaining function. We can't just stop everything that we're doing. But we are going to have to change the dynamics. So what I would suggest is that we can keep on learning from changes. How can we include flexibility and risk management in our operations, and hopefully go to more sustainable resilience management of our local ecosystems, goods and services. And so, thank you very much.
It is 6:28. Okay, so because I know there's not much time for questions, let's just have questions now and then we can have the pizza. Does that work? Okay, cool. Just for the people in Zoom, you don't have pizza, I'm sorry. But thank you so much to our presenters. And if you have any questions, please, oh shoot, oh no. So you guys didn't see the presentation. My apologies. I didn't share the screen, did I? Oh gosh, my apologies. Anyways, so that's okay. I have a recording, so I can send that to you guys later. But anyone have any questions for the panelists, presenters? Yes, Hangda? Yes.
Thank you for the presentation for environmental justice. I have a question about the current, so I'm working in the forestry industry for a while, and so I'm curious about your thoughts on the current consultation process with the other First Nations, especially out there in the Sake and Production. Are you aware of?
Oh yeah, no, I'm very aware, and I think it really depends on the circumstances. I don't know if you're aware, Sake and McLeod Lake gone in together to buy the timber license for their traditional territory. So with regards to consultation with my nation now, it's looking really good because we are buying the timber license, which means we have a say on whether people are actually harvesting our traditional territory. And a big part of that was adaptation. So it wasn't that we wanted to clear cut everything, although McLeod Lake's been in the news recently for a lot of clear cutting. It's a sense of, okay, this is the way the system works in Canada. If you want to cut down trees, you need to have a timber license. Canfor has had it historically. What happens if the nation buys it? And the nation has control. So McLeod Lake and Sake, that's what their approach was. For other communities, it really depends on the community and the circumstances. I would say though, as an overall kind of assessment of forestry in northern British Columbia, it's gotten a lot better than it was. So we talk about the 1950s, 1940s, and really getting into the present time. First Nations have had more and more say regarding what happens, what occurs, and how it occurs. And I think it's really easy to see it as First Nations people not wanting forestry at all, but that's not supported by the proof. There's tons of First Nations that have their own forestry companies that are interested in actually sustainably harvesting timber, if not even buying mills outright. Like famously purchased a mill in Mackenzie with the intention of having that continue to operate, providing employment for their community, but also for the non-Indigenous community. So yeah, I would say it depends, but it's gotten better. But it depends on the circumstances. Yeah.
So I also understand in Kansas TSA that this new forest landscape planning after the fourth trial and finished, Kansas will be the fourth one to actually do it. So I just wonder your thoughts on this new concept of like co-management, in consultation, but right now it's like co-management, so that licensees and First Nations manage this area together. Your thoughts, is it possible?
I think it's possible. I think it's certainly possible. It's hard to say how well it'll actually work out. Again, one of the reasons why my nation wanted to actually buy a timber license was so that they weren't necessarily doing that. For other nations, I think it's a possibility that exists. And part of it is kind of recognizing that, particularly here in BC, Aboriginal titles. And so how do you deal with that? Historically, it was by signing a treaty, but increasingly there's more and more First Nations who are interested in that. So that having co-management is seen as a wonderful. So I think there's a lot of hope. It's yet to be seen how successful it actually be.
Yeah, do you mind coming to the front? Actually, I forgot that the people in Zoom might not be able to hear you. Yeah, I'm sorry, not putting you on the spot or anything, but.
Was just interested in your presentation about the work you did in Mexico. And I was just wondering if at the course of your study, you identified any local adaptation strategy that one can leverage on. Looking at what Dr. Perez said during her presentation, we kind of saw how innovative approach could also contribute to the challenges of climate change of constitutes a problem to the indigenous communities. So I was wondering, rather than thinking of high-tech solution to climate change or the issue of drought in the community, so I was wondering if you identified any local strategy, and again, what is the history of drought like in the communities? Because I know is it one-time event or is it something that has happened over time, and how have they been able to overcome the challenges that we can learn from? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So actually, if you want, can you share my slides?
Yes.
So thank you very much for your question. And I just want to clarify, or at least me as an,
And
I don't want to say the other engineer on the side, but I would challenge people to think that there's no high tech or low tech, because whatever is low tech sometimes is very it can be very complex, right? So you can think of a constructed wetland to be considered like a low tech, but actually understanding the nature of those systems, it's very complex. We actually haven't been able to do that. It's easier to design high tech because these are highly manufactured solutions and anthropogenic and anthropocentric, versus if you start thinking about how do I improve an ecosystem, how to make it more functional, those are very hard questions to answer. So then, we can just discuss a little bit what's easier or not. So one of the things I wanted to say, for example, here where I was saying, the traditional activities of that place were agriculture, livestock, and horse breeding, for example. So if you think about livestock and horse breeding, they require a lot of water. Right? Just like, for example, the Amazons is drying up because there's all these ranchers in Brazil that are using up water. So what this community has had to do, because of its proximity to the Hermosillo city, they've started to migrate towards having more tourism. So what they'll put is restaurants basically there. And so some of the solutions we proposed when we were doing the side-by-side diagnosis, we also the diagnosis was problem, perception of problems, but we were also able to hear from them how they've been adapting by themselves. So that's what we're thinking about, building a capacity building. What are the things that they're already doing that is working for them, and how can we strengthen those adaptation processes? So a little bit like, the timber is there, the resources are there, maybe there's already an economy there. So how can we adapt with these processes in our own terms, right? Like that could be maybe a proposal. So for example, here, this solution that we looked at, like build local green infrastructure through reforestation. One of the things that what was happening is that there was a school teacher that was organizing kids to reforest the space, because that place had lost a lot of forest once upon a time because they've been doing a lot of construction in the Hermosillo and the neighboring city. So this teacher didn't they just had the will, but they didn't have the full understanding of which type of trees you wanted to put or why you wanted to put. So as you can see, we were like, we proposed two types of trees that they could plant. They could plant fruit trees. So they could eat them, like, so it'll grow and then they can eat them as well. But then we also providing trees that could provide shade in more of a green area. So here, for example, you have a high density of these shade trees. And one of the reasons for that was because this community had given, had designated this space of like a soccer field. And so what we're saying is, like, if they're having trouble finding a meeting place because of the heat, if we suggest for them to start having a lot of trees around them, there's going to be a nice shade area. You start creating a microclimate that's nicer. You know, you have more green infrastructure, and so people could start meeting here too. So that's sort of the type of solution that we provided. Another one is here, the produce local food sources for households and restaurants. So by us being able to, you know, if they are able to provide like small household scale orchards, they could start having like locally sourced, you know, fruits, vegetables that they could then use and sell also in their restaurants. So those were the type of capacity, like adaptive processes that they were already going through, like maybe for about 10 years. And then some of the solutions we gave them were complemented with our understanding of the ecosystem. Reduction of water consumption, of course, or promoting gray water reuse within households. Gray water reuse, like in Mexico, is very typical. Like people shower, they put a bucket underneath the shower, and then they use it for cleaning of water purposes. So what you can provide is you give them like a biofilter or provide some other type of technologies that people can use and then clean the water, because gray water can actually become hazardous if it's not used adequately. So yeah, there was a big, for us, it was understanding what they were doing and then how can we give them tools so that they can potentiate those adaptation processes already. So I don't know if I answered your question in that sense. Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Gabriel. And it's actually related with Dr. Jim's presentation, where he mentions that they were using the IPCC best practices to kind of inform the ways that they could propose work with the community. So I'm just wondering if within the multiple narratives that you explore in your research, have you come across maybe concepts of references of environmental justice or climate justice within those reports, which at the end are like Bibles within strategies that interdisciplinary researchers are doing for climate change adaptation in small communities?
Yeah, I mean, maybe sort of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, which was published 2022, was actually, you know, sort of speaking to some of the points that, you know, that I think are really central to sort of much broader conceptions of climate justice. That was, I think, the first assessment report where they specifically named, you know, sort of colonialism as, you know, sort of part of the, you know, contributor to the climate crisis, but also a, you know, sort of underpinning global climate-related injustices and the sort of uneven vulnerabilities on a global scale. So both in terms of those sort of broader, thinking about sort of climate justice and environmental justice in, you know, sort of in global terms, that at least, you know, it's sort of naming some of the historic and structural drivers of or underpinnings of sort of global injustices. And yeah, I think there is sort of also acknowledgement of the importance of centering, you know, sort of more localized adaptations and strategies. But it's it's always sort of a bit of both, in the sense that as much as there can be acknowledgement of, you know, some of these structural and historical dynamics, the you know, sort of structures that generate, that produce and reproduce vulnerabilities, and, you know, sort of will draw attention to the importance of, you know, the ways that people do adapt and, you know, sort of survive, adapt, survive and adapt to the impacts of climate change. There, you know, at the same time, there can still be, you know, sort of a, you know, the focus on these really, maybe the inherent, you know, it's a sort of inherent tension is that there, you know, there's also a focus on these really large scale, right, sort of green transitions and, you know, sort of more renewable energy and more wind farms and solar farms that, yeah, that generate further vulnerabilities for and sort of dispossessions for many communities. So yes and no. But I think, can I pick up on one of the points that June made about the sort of low tech, high tech and that distinction? I think what I was thinking of as you were talking about some of the responses and discussions, including the point about, you know, sort of staying, right? The least desirable option was to leave. And I think there's, yeah, problem, you know, sort of problematizing that categorization of high tech, low tech, but also often it seems as though there's all, you know, sort of there's you know, a determination of what counts as a good adaptation solution or not. And so, you know, sort of external perspectives that would say, well, staying put is maladaptive, or is, you know, sort of you're only generating further vulnerability to yourself. And the kinds of assumptions that are made or determinations that are externally made about what counts as a good sort of response or a good adaptation solution, I think is a really important one. When I was in Niger last summer, and, you know, the sort of Niger River runs through the capital, Niamey, and they're, you know, sort of affected by increasingly severe flooding, and a lot of, you know, sort of communities that have people who have moved to the capital for various reasons have settled in areas that are particularly prone to flooding, you know, some politics of land ownership and all of that. But part of, you know, their strategy for their adaptation to climate change is to periodically move, to move, you know, to settle somewhere nearby, but out of the sort of area of greatest risk of flooding in the sort of rainy season, then to move back. And for some, you know, so you might say that's, you know, so that's ridiculous, right? But that's the, you know, that's the strategy, and, you know, questions around, you know, sort of home and place. Anyway.
And then I think we have, do we have a question from Zoom? Oh, no. Okay, someone's leaving. Any other questions? If not, I have questions. Okay,
If you
so,
want, you can stop sharing because I don't distract.
oh, oops, yes. Oh gosh, I'm so bad with this technology stuff. Okay, so I have a question for June and Gabrielle, and then I have a separate question for Daniel. So I'll just say my first question to you guys first. So my question is, it's very interesting that the least desirable solution for people is to move from the place that they are if there's some climate change problem in their area. And I think that goes against, I think, people's preconceived ideas of what people want to do when they are in, you know, disaster zones, you know, that they want to leave, they want to immigrate. And there's a lot of anti-immigration sentiment and, oh, you know, we're against refugees coming, and they all want to come and they want to exploit our resources, they want to exploit our job market, all of those things. So I was wondering, in terms of climate adaptation then, how, is there any, let's say, political, let's say, drive to say that no, people don't want to adapt? And is it, how is it like in the countries where they are facing these disasters? Is the government really providing any resources for people to adapt at all? And it's, or is it like they're forcing them to go through the least desirable route, which is to immigrate from their home? So that's my question. Not sure that made sense. And then I'll ask you.
Okay. Okay, so there was like, I think there's more like two questions that you had.
Yeah,
One is
maybe.
like, what type of support do governments provide for
Yeah.
adaptation? That would be one question, and then the other one was more related to what they'll prefer to do if they're given support, is that?
Yeah, because I think what people are saying is that people want to immigrate and they want to like exploit the resources of countries where, you know, they have less climate issues, let's say.
Okay, also like, okay, from the global north perspective,
Yeah.
like, oh, everyone wants to, like,
That's right.
Europe, like all these people,
Exactly.
all these
Oh, we have
immigrants
so
want
much
to
water
be
in
here,
Canada, everyone
and so
wants to
everyone
come
wants to
here.
like, okay.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, this is an interesting question for just specifically the geographical location that I was talking about, the one, because it's a bordering state. Okay, so I'll answer the first one. So as I mentioned, Mexico has, has acknowledged climate change already for like 15 plus years. So they already have public policies around them. They have programs associated to them. But it comes back to the maladaptiveness, or for example, there's a very technocratic, technology-driven type of solution. So if you remember in my slides, what I was saying is that we were trying to provide well-being for households. We were trying to provide community, the well-being for the community. So for example, the reason we proposed, instead of having, oh, like everyone just give them more money so they can have more well drilling, we knew that that's gonna erode their ecosystem, like in the long term. If you keep on drilling your water wells, it's gonna have a major impact on your ecosystem, just like it's going to have. I don't know if you've heard about the Lower Mainland in BC. Wells dry up. I mean, it's just a reality, and then you can only do that for so long. So those type of unsustainable solutions, they're probably good for dams are an excellent example. Right, dams are really good for the first 50, 60 years, good, right? And then like, oh, I have water, I can produce energy, but you have created such a havoc in the ecosystem that, like you're probably gonna want to rewilder that river at some point, because the impact has been so massive. You really erode the capacity of the ecosystem to come back from it, or to keep on producing the services and functions that it's supposed to. So we have short-term, long-term, and I think sometimes with electoral processes, we saw it in this place in Sonora, I've seen it in Mexico, I think we've seen it here in Canada as well, where like electric vehicles, everyone, and then all of a sudden, they're super heavy, produce a lot of microplastics, it doesn't make a lot of sense in very northern communities, like in short, because it's so cold, like electric batteries are not very useful. So I think, it's a little bit, sometimes governments procure solutions. They'll have a budget, but then what type of solutions is the ones that they're gonna promote? I think, so we've seen that climate change has produced maladaptive practices, technologies that it's also who's lobbying the most, what type of solutions are the ones that are there. If conventional technologies are still the ones that are gonna be used, then, if conventional solutions are the ones that got us in the problem, then why are we keep on investing on those ones? Or, so that's one thing. I think another problem with local governments is that by the time the local government is able to provide, let's say the federal already has a vision, right? The federal governments have visions, then they go to the provincial ones, and then those provincial views, they may not really align they'll align to, let's say, big cities, right? Like a lot of people, I do water and sanitation solutions, and so a lot of the bylaws are great from Vancouver. They're fantastic for Toronto, and then they really are not good for rural communities. Very expensive. Do you have enough technical capabilities to maintain them, support them? They're very expensive. So that's another. And then just another thing I just wanted to say, that we are also not focusing enough on mitigation, right? So everyone's like, let's adapt. Well, let's stop this too, right? So it's like, so it's almost like, and I think that's a big criticism, that we keep on focusing a lot on adaptation. It's like, well, things are not going to change. They're not going to go back to where they go. So let's just keep on investing in adaptation. That could be maladaptive too. So I'll just, I've spoken a lot about that. And if you, again, if you want, you can talk about that, and then we can talk about the immigrant process. Because I'm not specialized in it, but I can tell you from this committee what I saw. And other committees.
So I would have a paper that should come out soon about climate change and displacement and migration, so I can talk about that for a while. But I think on the first question, I mean, the countries that have been the focus of my own research are, you know, I mean, histories of colonization and extraction and exploitation and, you know, which has profoundly disrupted, you know, sort of economies. And so I think there's also the question for me is not just sort of what are national governments doing, but, you know, sort of where is the funding coming from? And, you know, and especially in a global context in which, you know, the sort of that colonialism and the sort of causes of the climate crisis are so deeply intertwined. Colonial extraction, you know, sort of the industrialization and so on. There's been, you know, a lot of discussion, and this has been, was I think at COP28, you know, the sort of starting to include some language on, you know, sort of compensation for loss and damage, for instance. And, you know, what that might look like calls for climate reparations, right? You know, in order to finance responses to climate change in you know, formerly colonized countries, not just as part of, you know, sort of not just narrowly financing climate change responses, but also as part of much broader, you know, sort of obligations to reparation on the part of, you know, sort of former colonial powers, corporations that are responsible for the climate crisis and are not, you know, sort of don't seem particularly interested in mitigation, unfortunately. So I think the question of financing and where that comes from and what governments, you know, are willing to fund and what they have the capacity to fund, but also in, you know, in a context for countries who are very much reliant on external financing for, you know, sort of climate adaptations, you know, sort of what donors are, you know, sort of push, and, you know, sort of thinking about, you know, sort of World Bank funding, for instance, for climate action at the, you know, in lower income countries, that they do push these big, you know, sort of technology-driven, large-scale technology-driven solutions that are at odds with, you know, sort of the kinds of work that June is describing, right? The much more localized, collaboratively developed solutions. So I think it's, you know, sort of what national governments are willing to do, what they have the capacity, you know, sort of the possibility to do given, you know, sort of reliance on external funding, and how that fits into broader, you know, questions of, compensation for loss and damage, discussions around climate reparations, and so on. But I think, I think on the question of climate change and displacement and migration, a couple of years ago, oh gosh, I don't know what time it is anymore. Anyway, when the UK hosted whatever COP they hosted.
It's like 26.
Yeah, and so I was the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office commissioned, because the UK was hosting this particular COP, had commissioned sort of an evidence review on climate change and migration, and so I was involved in that, and you know, sort of which is a great opportunity to sort of get my head around what research has been done on the links between climate change and migration. And I mean, it's well documented, the vast majority, in contrast to the sort of panic-driven sort of catastrophe narratives that global North governments and, you know, sort of anti-migration, you know, sort of people will advance. The vast majority of migration, period, including linked to sort of environmental and climate displacement, takes place internally or within regions. That is, you know, sort of much more driven by, you know, structural, systemic, political, and economic factors as opposed to climate change. That, you know, just as much as the impacts of climate change might displace people, it also, the impacts of climate change, you know, be through loss of resources and income, can trap people in place, and so make it in many places harder to move rather than more likely. And I mean, there's a lot of really fantastic research that is focused on small island states, which are often, sort of identified as, sort of the places where the climate crisis is most evident and where, dynamics of migration, displacement, sort of are the most significant. But much of the existing research on climate change and mobility in small island states, sort of over and over and over again states that people want to stay, right? Whether it's because of attachment, ancestral attachments to place, sort of culture, family, sort of ways of living that, even though they're told, people are, sort of in these various studies, so people say, they're told over and over and over that, sort of your islands are disappearing and, everybody's going to be moving, but, sort of, yeah, the decision to stay is a very intentional one, which sort of links to it, which you observed in her own research. Yeah.
So we have 2 minutes. I will ask Daniel very quickly a question. You can, this quick one is an UNDRIP. I was wondering if you could talk about, because BC is, I think, the only province that has said that they will incorporate UNDRIP into legislation, which is a huge.
Well, as the federal government has as well. So
Right.
it's already, BC law is currently under the UNDRIP Act supposed to be in line with UNDRIP, so United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. So this just adds to what I was talking about with regards to Aboriginal rights and treaty rights, is that currently BC and the federal government are going through and revising legislation to make sure the legislation is in line with UNDRIP. And a big part of that is recognizing the ability of First Nations to govern themselves, to deal with these issues. So yeah, it's having a huge impact. Still too recent to say what the final result will be, but it's currently we're in this stage where the province is doing it, the federal government is doing it. I'm sure other provinces will follow suit eventually. And this is one of the big things with regards to Indigenous research I've been doing, is that the old deficit narratives that may have been true in the 1950s and 1960s are no longer true. And so things are changing. There are recent changes, but it's getting to the point where people who still cling to those old deficit narratives are increasingly being seen as people who believe stereotypes, and rather racist stereotypes, and Indigenous communities are no longer reflecting those stereotypes at all. The UNDRIP Act here is a good example of that, but also the actions the First Nations are taking before it and after it. So 2 summers ago, most First Nations of BC started actively looking at what to do with climate change. So what is our plan for climate change? This is what the projections are. How are we going to deal with it? How are we going to adapt? And it wasn't we hope that we're not going to hit 2.5, because we're going to blow past 2.5. Climate is going to change. What steps are we going to take? And that was something that most First Nations, like the 200 First Nations of BC, doing on their own initiative. And it is just largely recognition that the province isn't going to focus on them. The federal government isn't going to focus on them. And with things like UNDRIP taking place, if anything, the focus is being turned to the nations to actually decide how they want to deal with it. So my own community was, maps are out, research was out. Here's what we see the environment as currently. Here's what we project it's going to be like if the temperature reaches this level. Here's what's going to be like if the temperature reaches this level. What are our steps going to be with regards to not only hunting for food, but also forestry and other economic activities, and then related to global migration? What is our focus going to be if things change and suddenly Prince George wants more water from our traditional territory? How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to deal with maybe neighboring First Nations who want to be in our traditional territory? But then also even getting down to the nuts and bolts of like, what does this mean for caribou, which are already decimated, already facing extinction? Does it mean the caribou is gone? And then what does it mean? So yeah, kind of this response that is coming, but UNDRIP is really part of the larger response.